Any artist's new work often comes out of old work. If they say it's completely new work and has no relationship with what comes before, rubbish. I became, as I interested in, did a whole lot of work using lots of little pieces to suggest the ebbs and flows of crowds or flocks, and then evolved into large works like this, which had up to hundreds of pieces, long pieces going into it, suggesting perhaps a junction or inspired. The ones with lots were inspired by Banksia or Scotch thistle. And I started thinking about the gathering, lots and lots of people plugging in, and it sort of fit with the idea of the works that could be assembled after firing, as in that people would come to the event and then leave the event, and it could be a rearranging, coming together. And this was actually a solution to a problem. I had a work selected that I'd made and assembled with dry pieces of paper clay and hadn't actually stuck together, and got selected for an exhibition which was launching the Anne Lightwood's paper clay textbook in Scotland, in the UK. And it was a work similar sort of size to this, and I thought, well, hang on, I didn't have a kiln big enough to fire it, and also it would break when it was travelling, so I came up with the idea of adding bits after firing. So that was about the flows in and out. This was the same time the internet just started to happen, and in some ways these long connections between here in Perth and maybe 10,000 kilometres away to Scotland, and similar distance to Rossetti Gort, who's also an early leader in paper clay in the States. We're communicating first with letter and then with emails, and I started thinking about these connections, these long, and it's such a fragile connection because physically I hadn't met them, and with the internet there was no letters, it was just words on an email. And when I first started getting emails, I was part of a university at that stage, Curtin, doing my honours, and you had to go and pick up a printout every day of all the communication, and then you'd go in and type away on a little green screen, or it's green, white screen, and then come back the next day and get the printout in your pigeonhole. Very long connections. Anyway, I started thinking about that whole thing, and I started looking at some of the theories about connections between individuals, and some of the first theories were social network analysis and visualization. When I first started looking, this was nearly 15 years ago, so I started thinking about the connections between individuals, but also moved on from these flows or flocks or crowd sort of movements. Started reading up, found theories called social network analysis and visualization. What a mouthful. And there was originally software out there. It was used by the police, CIB, FBI, whatever, and bank fraud, and a hugely expensive $10,000 for the software and similar amount for training. I couldn't afford as an artist, although I met with the police there in Perth. They offered to allow me to use this software, but I wasn't quite ready for that. And I started looking at some of the imagery, and they had lots of nodes connected to each other, multiples, and started researching. I actually joined the national and international associations. This is my family tree, which doesn't look like a family tree. It looks almost like a DNA, but it's actually, the brown ones are dead members of the family, up to connected going through, and then there's children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren as it's grown on from that. So that sort of idea, and they were providing visual images of this, but not three-dimensional models. So I was figuring it out, how to draw it in space sculpture and things that you didn't learn. And then the other thing that happened was I started thinking, well, three-dimensional DNA maps I was making was trying to understand my relationships, my family relationships, but also studio relationships, and then with my students and artists overseas, and started thinking about these connections. The difficulty was that it's very mathematical. Looks like a molecular structure, and doesn't, like biological parent to children is a straight line, but it doesn't really in those family trees relate the sibling, brothers and sisters communications, uncle and auntie communication. So I started to thinking about these other communications, these other links. At that stage we didn't have social media, we didn't have Facebook, Instagram, that sort of thing. And so this is my dad's mum's parents, my great-grandparents, and one of these is my grandmother, and they're connected. So the parents, great-grandparents, are connected based on how many years they were together, and then there's a connection between both of them and their children. But by using a circle rather than a sphere, I could attach in a different way. I could attach both on the edge this way, but also the edge this way, but also between them. So what I did is I got some 3D printer filament, which I played around with, and I'll talk about that later, and put that as a communication between my grandmother and her siblings, her 12, 13 siblings. And so we don't have a record of that communication in family trees. And I started thinking about, well, circles are quite useful, donuts, a useful way. And I started originally doing that, and I found I was doing work when I was into the residency in India, playing with that idea. Then I started thinking about more a subjective experience. So circles, and I'm interacting with the world, but I'm also creating an internal space. I started doing work, so I haven't got an image here, but we can put it up, of circles within circles within circles. So in this sense, you've got a wire that's providing a structure which is separate to ceramics. We have a backbone, I suppose. I started thinking about with mortality in the family, and thinking about ceramics. I always wanted to combine wire and ceramics. So these works were playing with using wire to communicate something separate, a biological family tree, genealogy connection, or a siblings communications, letters, meetings, things that wasn't recorded, lost. Started thinking about, well, how can I put the wire inside the ceramics and make it stronger? So it sort of moves to more to metaphysical, is that the word, idea, that ceramics is quite fragile. A lot of the work was about being fragile, delicate, long, extended pieces, reflecting emotional or connection or movement, because always that thing between illustrating the collective and also the subjective experience. This could be me and all my connections and fragile connections, but also started thinking about mortality with different previous generations of family. And so I started the idea of you putting wire into ceramics to make it stronger. In a sense, we have telecommunication, but if your battery goes flat, or your camera battery goes flat, end of story. We're no longer recorded, no longer exists. And ceramics is quite fragile, but you can bury it and dig it up in 10,000 years and it still have the same shape. I started thinking about how do I incorporate wire to suggest something else, but also to increase the strength of delicate work. So at the moment, this project, I talked about this idea in a number of workshops I gave in the States and talked to people, and I documented that in an article in the American Studio Potter. There's an article on my website, you can read it. And more recently, I've been able to, 2023, 24, I finally cleared enough space in the studio to start experimenting. And this is where these sort of work came through. This is an early experimental version of it, using a combination of paper and ceramics. Now, I also, parallel to my ceramics practice, I have a paper practice, building up to 3-ton sculptures in compressed paper, which are not fired, versus ceramics, which is paper mixed with clay and fired. And the compressed paper always had a steel rod through it to hold it together. So now I'm sort of bringing the metal, the wire, across into my ceramics. And I was able to now create works like this, which have up, this one probably has about 10 metres of wire in it, which the paper and paper clay has been built over, and I figured out how to fire it without it cracking. So the next challenge is to scale it up, but also to build thinner and thinner work. So at the moment that's sort of the direction in a technical sense. So I'm not quite sure, I'm still finding the connection between, apart from the technical connection, the theme, it's more of a subjective, I think, experience. It's interesting, one of the works in this series won a prize in New Zealand, and the judges sort of had tremendous energy and dynamicism, which I hadn't really thought about. I was just busy trying to, like that work was made out of lots of spirals making up 2 chambers. And originally I was thinking about parents, chambers, that sort of thing, or relationships, you know. We form relationships with life relationships, partnerships. But it could, I was thinking about the other night, I was thinking it could be heart, that sort of thing. And also associated with I started using colour again. I haven't really been using colour until recent. Just in the last couple of years, putting a bit of blue oxide through it, and not this work but other work like this, I've started using colour in it as well. So that's also an area that I'm sort of playing with at the moment. The other thing which I haven't talked about, because I haven't got any finished work, is using toast. At the moment I'm playing around with bread or toast. So I've made plaster casts of the toast and then cast porcelain paper clay into it. I've just put a bit of terracotta slip on that just so you can see it a bit more clearly in the camera perhaps. I'm just playing with that idea of making lots and lots of slices and then building a number of structures with that. It's very early at this stage, where I made 2 towers out of around about 4,000 ceramic phones modelled on the iPhone. And that work I had the idea of making 2 towers. So I started making, I had to make them life-size phones, otherwise people wouldn't recognise them. Started laying them in circles, and then realised that I wanted it life-size. So then I had to go up, so then I had to drill holes in them, and I put coat hanger wire between them, laying them like bricks. It's actually a basket weaving technique. Another thing, when my mum used to park 6 kids at the local Busy Bee, and for a couple of hours she had free while we were taught how to do basket making. Anyway, it's another story. So I started building up these phones and then realised I wanted human height, so then I had to drill the holes thicker to make them stronger, the support, and then eventually wanted to make it like 2 faces. Often the work, one thing leads to another. So at the moment I'm making lots and lots of little slip cast paper clay porcelain toasts or bread slices, and then we'll see how the work evolves from there. I'm sort of interested in that whole idea of economic sort of distribution between geographical, demographic differences, but we'll see how it goes. It may also be about security, that sort of thing, in these increasingly dynamic times we live in, who knows. Anyway, that's where I'm at the moment.